Hey, welcome to another episode of the PlaceOS podcast. This week I'm talking to Brooke. Hi, Brooke.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And this is my first remote interview, and I typically open up our internal conversations with one question. I want to tweak it this week, and I usually ask what industry trends have you noticed? I want to think bigger with you today and ask what industry trends should there be? What's missing? What is not a trend but we wish it was?
I think across the board in the last few years, going to lots of events, there's lots of people that maybe just want to have a startup to say they're doing a startup. So I think there's a really big push on having a business or something that makes you feel really good because it really contributes to your ego. But I think moving forward, the trends that there should be are looking at really functional things. If you look at all of the money that Amazon has made, it's been in what traditionally has been quite boring aspects. So when you think about logistics or cloud computing and things like that, before it was just something that people paid for as a service. So going through things that maybe were something you paid for before as a business and then having that as a product, I think moving towards really functional solutions rather than something that sounds good at an event is something that I would like to see across the industry.
I think, so another sort of bullet point I had down today for our conversation was the word digital twins. And I think I'll bring that more forward in our conversation because that's what I'm thinking of when you just said that. So relating that to our sort of industry of smart buildings, I feel like there was a lot of companies that started as a digital twins company without really having a practical use of digital twins, or the more manual way, or not using AI is still better than using AI or what they're classifying as digital twins. What's your experience with digital twins in particular, as maybe an extension of what you just said?
I think it's very similar to some points that you've touched on, but so much of it, again, is people just wanting to say the word digital twin. Finding out what that is actually for is often more useful, and really bringing it back to the user experiences and user journeys that you would want to have as part of having a digital twin. It doesn't mean that digital twins as a concept don't have use, but it's more about finding what is the specific use case that you're wanting to work with, and how have you best used technology as a way to get to that end point, rather than you wanted to do a talk about digital twins.
Yeah, and I think if we focus on like the practical application of digital twins, I mean, if digital twins is how it works, and you're describing a function within your technology stack, then that's fine. But if you're just leading with this is a digital twins platform rather than this is an end-to-end asset lifecycle management platform for the building industry, that's a much more practical way of looking at it. Like, what is its actual use? And let's not focus on the technology trend, but the user case, the application. And sure, it might leverage digital twin technology, but we also don't lead with like saying things are a database technology when it leverages a database.
Yeah, definitely. And I think data lakes is a good example of this as well. I think people just like saying the word data lake. It always comes back to when I go for walks in the financial area of town and just hearing people talk about big data when they really don't know what they're talking about, but they just know they want the biggest and they want the most, and they just want to sort of hoard it. So bringing it back to what are you actually using all of this stuff for, and what's the actual underlying function that you would like to get to. And I think once you start having those conversations, it leads more into really values-based discussions around what do we have now and where do we want to be, and how can we use data and technology to get to that end location.
Yeah, so if we remove the hype and buzzwords and trends and to your point, look at the practical use of technology, what are you seeing that you like out there today that is practical, that is being used effectively?
I think more open conversations about how to get training data. This is something that I've seen a lot of just moving through when you talk about artificial intelligence. There are lots of SaaS solutions or other nice fancy solutions with really slick UIs that often do really well in lots of rating and comparison websites. But at the end of the day, it's sort of just like having a very fancy kitchen. If all of your ingredients are rotten, you're not going to be able to cook a nice dish regardless of how expensive your equipment is. So what I'm seeing as a good trend is different ways that you can get good training data so that then down the line, when you are ready to use a model, you have data to model that AI with. And that's becoming more and more important now that we've sort of seeing the first wave of really initial early adoption of AI, and then people realizing that the forecasting maybe isn't as good as what they thought it would be, or maybe the applications of it aren't as good as they thought it would be, because the part that they really wanted to predict or forecast or approximate with AI, they don't have any training data to get to that point. So I think there's a trend that's really growing now of people, what are the actual questions we need to answer with AI, and then how can we set ourselves up for success in terms of really collecting training data, because that's a very, very valuable resource for organizations, especially quite large companies.
Yeah, and I always think back to how I got started in technology was really with music and audio, and like any system, the data you put into it, you want the most high quality data at the beginning. And there's always the saying, you can't polish a turd, is the Australian way of saying it. That would always talk about when recording music. You need a good quality recording, and that starts with the musician and the musical instrument before you even introduce music technology to the mix. And I think that following the signal flow of any system, the data input is extremely important. So we jumped straight into talking about data, and that started by talking about digital twins and picking on digital twins a little bit. But why are you interested in this specifically in data?
Yeah, so I studied pure maths at university, and now I get to talk to lots of school students, especially girls from regional Australia, about what being a mathematician is actually like in a job. And when I always talk about what I do for work, it's just creative problem solving and talking to people to find questions and then using data to find the answers to that. That's what I really enjoy about data, because it's so much of a conversation and bringing in everything that you have sort of in a toolbox. There's lots of different analytical tools you can use. And then it's creatively finding the right tool for the job and then working out how you can layer other experiences on top of that. And that's, how I sort of bring everything back together.
And I mean, the message I go on about a lot is that people that present themselves as data experts are quite often database experts. They're not exactly providing any insights. They just set up good IT systems to collect the data. What's your view on how people get involved in data from an analytical point of view?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because at the end of the day, your data usually does need to come from people. And regardless of how good you are at setting up database systems, if you're only having data coming from a few really small sources, that you're getting selection bias from that if you're only choosing a few small sources. So what I really enjoy, especially working with the different types of stakeholders that we have at PlaceOS, is working out how we can get all of the voices and opinions from different people within the space and how we can help them to have their voice heard within the data. I think that's been a big shift in the industry of late, because it's not just saying people will like what I tell them to like, but more about a conversation and how you can help people to connect and be a part of that conversation.
Well, it's interesting. Like, I have meetings sometimes with end customers where we spend an hour, 2 hours talking about the process of streaming the data from an integration into a data lake. And no one's talking about any people's involvement, any stakeholder groups, and what insights they're after. We put so much attention on the process and the technology, and this is going to lead to your point earlier that we're going to have the wrong input if we're just streaming everything to a data lake and hoping for the best. We're either going to end up with too much data to organize and to know what to do with, or we might miss the opportunity to collect the right data in the first place.
Yeah, I have an article called How to Be Data-Driven and Not Data Derailed, and it's all about this. So usually it's sort of 80-20 rule in action. So 20% of your available data will lead to 80% of your insights. But you can only find that at scale if you're really talking to people along the way. And if you get too much data and you're inundated, you can't do anything with it because you don't know where to start, and you don't even know how to prioritize what you're working with if you don't have those conversations with key people across a business first. And in practice, prioritization of what you're working with and what you're going through is often as important a part of the process as the actual analysis part.
Yeah. And I guess like any user experience, maybe you don't agree to the statement, but I look at data as part of the user experience. It's the same sort of process of defining what the user wants, but instead of an action, it's maybe the other way around. You're receiving information, which you can then later action. And I think that's
people telling you what they want at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think often the missed opportunity is with data is using it to action something. People just sort of expect it to be streamed off somewhere via MQTT and it sits in a data lake and their job is done. But why collect that data in the first place unless we do something with it? And that end-to-end sort of user experience scoping is important to put the context into place.
Yeah, especially when I talk about breaking UX down, there's a diagram that I have. Maybe Jordy will put it in when he edits.
Yeah.
But so it's the idea of there's some features that the value in it is just removing something negative as part of the process. So in any sort of process, maybe someone has to crush 3 different Excel spreadsheets to find a number. If you can get the product to just calculate that for them, you have added value by just removing something terrible as part of that process. And that's often more valuable than the really sizzle features, like they want a hover car or something like that. The functional pieces that remove a dreadful part of the process, that's where often a lot of the value lies. So by having better data inputs and more inputs from more people, you can really find that low-hanging fruit that will then create a really good foundation that you can build upon for the sizzle features that will be more exciting to talk about in meetings.
Yeah. One thought I just had is a lot of the role when it comes to data science and particularly scoping is communication. Because if you're listening to like what is the outcome anyway, then you have to decide what integration do we need to get the right data to achieve that outcome. How do you find that in terms of your pure mathematics background and this area of communicating? Is it a matter of learning a whole bunch of analogies to make it relatable to people? Or is it just something you have naturally?
I don't think it's necessarily something I had fully naturally all the time. I've always really enjoyed storytelling. I used to write loads of nonfiction when I was younger. And it only really started to make sense in my career when I worked out how to craft narratives with data. And that's sort of the process in terms of a way to make my voice heard. And like I have a whole keynote about this, but all of this is because no one really listened to me when I started working for a variety of reasons, but I just turned it into a sport essentially and found different ways to get to that end point. And along the way, I've also worked in marketing and learned so much about consumer behavior and behavioral science and all of those aspects, and then applied that to UX as well. And then now in analytics lead role. So just more understanding why people are the way that they are, as well as talking to them as well, because often when you look at data, maybe people's attitudes and behaviors will be 2 very different data points and saying very different things for the same aspect. Like on a website, people might say they really like a page, but the analytics of that page show you that it's not doing what anyone wants them to do. So how they feel and what's actually happening are 2 different things. And the dichotomy between that often has really good insights in it, even though it seems like it wouldn't make any sense. So the idea of people's opinions and actions are often quite different, but instead of just ignoring that or assuming it's not the case, work out how you can sort of volley with that and work out what's actually happening.
It's interesting the consumer behavior and looking at that as inspiration to a lot of our workers in enterprise workplace. And sometimes we forget that at the end of the day, they are consumers. These are just human beings that have the same goals and desires as when you were looking at more marketing focusing analytics. And that's, I think maybe it's nice that we can look at analytics in this way that's not trying to sell somebody something, but use some of the same sort of psychology and understanding of digital trends and behaviors that can lead to better user experience, not more sales.
Yeah, and especially when there's so many people in an organization now that understand conversion optimization.
Yeah.
Lots of people who wouldn't consider themselves data people are probably have a really good handle on marketing analytics. And at
Yeah.
the end of the day, even if we're not selling someone something, if the organization's goal is, I don't know, they want people to volunteer to start earlier in the day so that they can manage utilization across the day, one of your conversions can be someone starting earlier in the day. And then you can look at the attributing factors to whether or not someone converts or not. Doesn't matter that they're not buying shoes or something, but working out how you can bring in all of this research that has existed for a long time and has been optimized over such a long time and just apply it to a different concept. And I think that's what's really exciting about what we've been doing.
Yeah, even the simple things of ads are more effective if they're delivered at the right time and the right place.
Yeah, and it's connecting someone's who they are, where they are, what they're doing, all of those factors.
Yeah.
So it's just applying that with a less consumerist angle.
And this is this is what we go on about a lot in all of our sales presentations at PlaceOS, is that context is key. That we're trying to use digital technology and integrations to get the most context so we can trigger things automatically. And rather than triggering things to sell, we're triggering things to improve the user experience. Sometimes I don't look at it in that way, but it's definitely inspired by that industry of just consumer behavior.
Yeah, and even when you're communicating data, when we were talking about how to actually do that, all of that comes down to the context, because at the end of the day, if you show, utilization in a building is up 30% year on year, the best thing that can happen is someone will ask you why. So unless you've got anything context-wise to back that up, you haven't really done your job, because the best outcome has happened and you've got nothing to back it up with. So look at what either correlation or causation is happening, and then seeing what you can actually do to move on, because the why and the how is what ends up making a decision later on.
Can you drill down on that a little bit? Because one thing I've learned from you is some language and ways of looking at things in terms of data. And a specific thing for me is this concept of outliers or outlying events. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think people always remind me of cats a bit when they're looking at dashboards. I think people, especially now that a lot of people are working from home, so they might be physically separated from whatever they're looking at, but the notion of just wanting to feel more in control by looking at numbers going up and down, when really you're just passively looking at the output of a system, you're not actively making decisions. So the concept of outliers is sort of, because there's always this middle section when you look at utilization in a building. So that's how many people are in the space versus how many people the space can hold. And for most organizations, the sort of natural middle band of that doesn't matter, because there's always going to be flux of people moving around the space, or the difference between a Tuesday and a Thursday. That doesn't actually matter. But the idea of looking at when that's really low or really high, so there's lots of different statistical ways you can determine outliers, and then looking at what's happening to make it much lower or much higher. And often that will tell you more about a story and what's happening. And looking at outliers is one of the ways that I always tell people to look for take-home points to tell people about data sets, because it prompts you to look at all the different contextual factors that are at play that can then help you with the more middle-of-the-road measures as well.
So if you see an outlier event in your data, what's the next step? Is that where a human gets involved and literally just says, well, why did this happen? And let's investigate?
Yeah, so there's a few ways you could do it. Honestly, there's some people that would want to just use AI, the magical AI box, to do this. But I think in a lot of cases, just asking a human is probably a better case, especially when there's so many front of house customer service people that you could ask that would tell you, and then you can use that data to input to another system. Because you might think, oh, it's fantastic, we've got such a huge spike in utilization today, but then it just turns out there was a tour group coming through. Or it might look like the utilization was really low on a certain week, and it's just, oh no, that was when bushfires came through, so everyone was working from home because it wasn't safe to be in the office. So just, you could spend a lot of time having a lot of integrations going through that. But I think having humans assisting the algorithm rather than working against each other or trying one to take over from the other entirely, I think a hybrid model really is what will help give the most context, because you're allowing humans to do what humans can do best, and then you're allowing any sort of prediction model you have to do the best it can do as well with that input.
Yeah. And setting rules and conditions, basic logic around outliers can probably achieve, a lot of value, but really asking why and putting it into context with something that humans know that might not even be in a record of truth to connect to, like the tour group, maybe that's not documented anyway, so we can't get that data automatically. It has to be someone like, oh, that's right. It was a school excursion actually, and we had 30 kids walk through that day.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about smart buildings in general, and something you've been working on with me is scoping residential. So smart residential and aged care. What do you think is transferable from some of the stuff we've done in workplace, and what do you think is going to take some time before the industry or the technology is ready?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting space. One of the key things that I can think of is the idea of adding value to a property. So whether that's an aged care facility or a residential tower, something to that effect, through the digital experiences rather than through architecture or a nice facade or an expensive water feature somewhere in the lobby. The idea that you can use technology to open up really good experiences that will affect their cash flow in a different way to the development, but make your development stand out amongst a sea of others. And one of the simplest ways that you can unlock a lot of experiences is with Wi-Fi and access control. So the idea that in a residential building or aged care facility, if you can give someone spot access to your room for a certain reason. So I've ordered my groceries online and I would like to pay someone to unload them in my pantry for me. That's a really helpful tool to have. Or there's going to be a personal chef that will come in to my room and I can give them access and I'll know when they enter and when they leave and they can come in to do that, or any sort of maintenance and tools like that. I think it sounds so menial, but it really unlocks so many services. And from the realtor or the aged care facilities point of view, they can have staff that are really specifically trained in good skills, and then they can use some just really basic scheduling to work out where they'll be going and what they'll be doing and add value to people's lives through that aspect, rather than necessarily spending an extra few million on the outside of the building and then just hoping that pays off over time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like it literally unlocks new possibilities because some of...
walk on that.
Oh, do you have to wave your hands? There we go.
I don't know if it will come up. Oh, how good are sensor lights, everyone? I'm going to walk around and come back maybe.
And we're back.
How good are connected lighting experiences?
Yeah. This is exactly a problem that comes up all the time in meetings.
Yeah.
Like, how do we do energy efficiency, but without something as dumb as a motion sensor? It's quite easy. We could track you more effectively than just a sensor that turns on and off and doesn't turn on if you're not moving.
Yeah, or even like I've booked this space. So there's a booking somewhere attributed to our account where I have booked it. So yeah, it's very fun.
But it doesn't validate if you've turned up or not.
Right.
So there's no intelligence, there's no validation. All of these problems we could solve, and we're just, pick our battles. We're not trying to solve problems for WeWork at the moment. But we are trying to solve them for residential, and it's something we were just talking about. So it's interesting when you define some features or you define some problems that the customers in that vertical are having. We quickly then shift gears into what is the integration that's going to make that happen? To either give us the data or to trigger the action. And there's one that is really simple for us, but ticks a lot of boxes, and that's the building access control. So if we can read and write and dynamically assign privileges to people to access a building and then open the door when they arrive, we can achieve a number of the user cases you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And then it's just having a platform that adds the other integrations to achieve more than that. One might be to validate when they actually get there, so we know if we're expecting something, to validate when it happens, and then to let them in and securely and then revoke their access when they've left and delivered that service.
Yeah.
For me, this first started in workplaces becoming more hospitality focused. So a workplace that wants to provide services to their employees. And I feel like if we now take this to residential, it's almost like going to the source. We touched on how everyone's a consumer. We're using our experience of employee experiences, but now we're looking at just dwelling experiences in general.
Yeah, and so much of this as well is because I used to live on the 40th floor of a building in the city, and so many things could have been so good but were so bizarre. Like if I had a visitor coming by car, I would be on the 40th floor. I would have to run down to ground floor to help them find the car park entry, because even if I could beep them in, they couldn't find it anyway. Then I would chase them down to B1 once I'd let them in. And then from B1, we would have to go to ground floor where they would get a parking permit. We would go down to B1 to put it on their car. And then from B1, we could go up to level 40. It was just absolute chaos, but I could give them credentials that only worked when they arrived, for example, or they only worked for a given time. And then we would know where they were and we could automatically connect it to their car number plate. It just so many aspects, because then you're welcoming a visitor to your home. Like one of my friends would be coming over and it would just be absolute chaos, and the most bizarre way to enter a building, because it's not a smooth experience and it's not showing the building in its best light, even when you're welcoming a visitor.
And it's just a waste of time, particularly if you're paying contractors an hourly rate. You don't want to mess about like in that scenario you went through. And so one of the trends I'm seeing is, well, a trend that's been around for a while is that hospitality experience going into enterprise workplace. But what we're talking about right now is the other way around. The trend I'm seeing is workplace coming into, hospitality and residential. And as we all work from home more frequently, it's important to have these lines completely blurred or removed. And I think that's where we're uniquely positioned, because we started, with one problem, but a lot of this is just transferable. My question is, what do you think is going to be the hardest part here to ultimately deliver user experiences in residential space?
I think finding a partner to work with that would absolutely dive in and do it. Because if you do all of this and you actually find really good people on the ground to be running these services, you just need someone to take charge of, yes, I will be in charge of all of the chefs, maintenance staff, masseuse, whatever you want to have to come into your building. And if you have the right people on the ground managing that, we have already proven that we can do all of the data and actual tech side of this. That's been proven, but it's just about finding who's ready to get their people on the ground to do this as well.
Yeah, and I think part of that problem is that the partners focus on specific areas. And obviously there's already other products on the market that also just focus on certain areas like facility management or concierge services only. But there's nothing linking it all together from the basement to the lobby to the dwelling and all the devices in the dwelling, and then all of the services that could be part of the precinct and ultimately the city. That's where we play a role. I think as verticals like this, it's really led to PlaceOS embracing a marketplace, so we can have others release these sort of products in the marketplace, but maybe lead by example and get started doing something cool with residential.
Definitely, because there's such a marketplace, even when you look at aged care, as in there's many people that when they retire, they would like to downsize their home, but they're not ready to go into a more high-end or high care, I guess, aged care facility. But the idea of saying, because these people as well, there's so many people that are experiencing all of these connected workplace experiences in their workplace now, but when they retire, they'll just not have access to all of these connected things that are in their workplace. So things that will just make your retirement more like a hotel, I guess, with the concierge-like aspects. So things like, do you necessarily need someone to carry all of your groceries up and unload them for you? No, but it's really nice. And that idea of downsizing your physical home, but not your lifestyle. And then even maybe you've downsized your home so you don't have the big entertaining area that you once had. However, you can book out any of the spaces within the precinct that you can then have a catering staff put in there, or maybe you've got a personal chef that you can also give access to the space that you've booked. All of this stuff happens, and really thinking about lifestyle as a more broad concept rather than just limiting it to this is your home, your little box within a building, but all of the pieces of the puzzle that can really extend your ability to have fun there, I guess. It's a big...
Yeah. And this is heavily related to smart cities, because what we're talking about here is basically the benefit of high density living and high rise apartments is that you can have lots of amazing shared facilities that you wouldn't have access to if you lived in a quarter acre home, freestanding home in the suburbs. It'll take a huge expense to match the same facilities that you have access to.
Yeah.
And to your point about expectations of technology from one stage of your life to the next, we've seen that with our university customers that look at what the schools are doing in terms of technology and how there's connected students. In kindergarten, they have a technology experience that exceeds what the universities are offering, in some cases, particularly at private schools that invest heavily in technology. Then they get into a university environment where they're sometimes let down by the technology service or the technology availability. And then from the university space, if that is a little bit better than most workplaces, they move into the workplace and the technology is not as great as they had at university nor at school. And then each stage of their life, they have higher expectations, but it seems that the more you move through life, the less the technology is, all the way to aged care, which, the technology isn't great there right now. So it's interesting following that journey and how there's sometimes gaps as you transition.
And it's interesting for schools as well, because lots of the technology within that space, there's some for the student, but it's also for their family and caregivers. And that's really similar with aged care as well. So the idea of maybe you've got select contacts that your children, and that your children maybe get a notification when you come home, or if something hasn't happened, your children can get a notification, which is sort of the opposite of what would happen at school. But I think as people have been quite physically disconnected from their families during COVID and aged care facility lockdowns, the idea of having really good communication of what's happening and where things are, and really transparent communication within your trusted and private group, I think that has a lot of value, even though it doesn't sound that technologically exciting.
Yeah. And I think there's an opportunity. What there is no one doing right now is connecting all of these together, like one platform that can serve all of these different types of real estate and stages of life, because a lot of this is transferable. The caring for young students versus caring for older relatives in your family. It's very similar in terms of technology integration and technology requirements, but there's such gaps and silos in the building, in an individual building alone, let alone the whole city and multiple types of dwellings. I think that's the hardest challenge to solve. Is not so much the technology readiness, but the who even buys this? Does the city buy this on behalf of multiple stakeholders, or do you have to find a property developer that works in each of these areas and they are smart enough to look at everything in a uniform light? That's something I don't think we can solve, but eventually it will get better as time goes on.
Yeah, and it all comes back to context. When you look at different users in different ages, they all have Wi-Fi and they've all got doors as just a baseline example of Wi-Fi and access control, but context as in the lens that you look through for different types of users. I think we have a really core base of technology, but it's just about actual context within who are the users and what do they need from this element, which is why, to our point earlier, just the data alone without context is not enough, because it doesn't give you the whole picture and the whole story. So by actually looking at the different use cases across things, then you can have the same integrations running in the background. So this baseline technical foundation, and then just looking at different ways you can layer on top of that to create different experiences.
And I mean, that's a great point, because you could start really simply by looking at one user experience that is across multiple industries, and that could be building access and dynamic building access with service providers allowed to come in to do their job, and then grow from there. And that's, again, to the reason we have a marketplace, or soon to launch one, is because that can be our offering, the base level, and others can build on top, either end clients or people providing services to those end clients can build their own products on top of that base offering. And one problem that is solving itself is connectivity. So with wireless technology in buildings and PoE devices in buildings now. That's a big one, a big trend that will drive a lot of this, is that PoE, so the power over Ethernet, is now at a level that it can power more than just low-powered devices. It can be a network of your electricity, basically, and then everything's connected by default. Therefore, we can get data out of it. We can control it, send commands to it, and that just means we can assume everything's connected. Now what? What do we want to do now that we can assume everything's connected?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's sort of a good summary of what we're working on at the moment: data integration, some new verticals such as residential and aged care, and the similarities of all of those verticals. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up?
That's all I can think of at the moment. There's probably more, but
Okay, well, thanks, Brooke.
thanks so much for having me.